We are today going to tackle chapters 6 and 7. And I'll just remind you that what we talked about in terms of these two chapters, we are not going to read them verse by verse. These chapters are very detailed, having to do with the building of the temple. And a lot of these verses go into the actual building materials and the shapes and the sizes of everything. So rather than read through all of it and explain every chapter, every verse, what I decided is to pull out to actually, I'm focusing on two different issues, which will take us at least two classes this week and next week, and possibly a third. Very likely a third, I think, but we'll see how it goes. So the first thing that I wanted to do was to focus on particular verses that we see in these two chapters that have some kind of significance, meaning, verses that I wanted to, even if we're not going verse by verse, that these verses I did want to make sure and study. And then the second thing we're going to discuss is the comparison between the tabernacle and the temple. The tabernacle, the instructions for which are extremely detailed in the book of Exodus, and the temple, and there are some significant differences. And so we'll discuss what are the differences and then some understandings of why there are the differences. So that will be the second stage of our study. Okay, so why don't we start here with some of these verses that I wanted to point out. Okay, so first of all, we read verse 1 last week. We'll review it again. In the 480th year after the Israelites left the land of Egypt, in the month of Ziv, that is the second month, which is what we would call Iyar now. In the fourth year of his reign over Israel, Solomon began to build the house of the Lord. The house which Solomon built for the Lord was 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. So first we have its length, width, and height, and then it goes on and talks about the various measurements, etc., which we'll get to. So now I wanted to take a look at verse 11 through 13, okay? So the first 10 verses, we have some detail about the house in general, some of the details, some of the whatever, and then it gets much more detailed afterwards. But then there's a break, and that's verses 11 through 13. It says as follows: Then the word of the Lord came to Solomon, with regard to this house you are building, if you follow my laws and observe my rules and faithfully keep my commandments, I will fulfill for you the promise that I gave to your father David. I will abide among the children of Israel. My Bible says abide. A more accurate translation would be, I will dwell within the children of Israel, and I will never forsake my people Israel. Okay, so first of all, there's two parts to these verses here. The beginning reminds us of what we had earlier in chapter 3. We'll go back to that in a second. But basically, God is giving a condition. He's saying, first of all, he says, with regard to the house. And he's saying, if you follow my laws, if you observe the commandments, then I'll fulfill the promise I made to David. Okay, so we're going to have to look into what exactly was that promise. And then the second piece of that is, I will dwell amongst the children of Israel, and I will never forsake my people Israel. So one of the questions that we have is verse 13 part of the condition? Verse 12 sets out a condition. If you follow my rules, then I will fulfill my promise. Okay? The question then becomes, is that then also apply to verse 14. Then I will fulfill my promise to David, and then I will dwell among the children of Israel, and I will never forsake you. Now, one of the problems with saying that verse 13 is part of the if-then equation is, as soon as you say, I will never forsake my people Israel, how can you say that that becomes conditional? It's either, if you obey my commandments, I won't forsake you. But if you say, I will never forsake you, by definition, it would think that it's not a condition. Never is very absolute. That's just it. I will never forsake you. So first of all, let's go back to chapter 3, verse 14, which we just, discussed a few weeks ago. And here, chapter 3, verse 14, here we have Solomon. We have Solomon himself going to Gibeon, praying to God and asking him to give him wisdom, etc., blessing his kingdom. And in verse 14, we have if you'll recall, Solomon is very righteous. He doesn't ask for wealth or power. He asks for wisdom. He asks for the ability to judge correctly and rule correctly, but he doesn't ask for money and power. But then God says, you didn't ask for it, but I'm going to give it to you. And God sees this as a very righteous type of request. And then he says in verse 14, and I will further grant you long life if you will walk in my ways and observe my laws and commandments, as did your father David. So this condition here is the same if you walk in my ways and if you obey my commandments. In our chapter, in chapter 6, the then is, I will fulfill what I promised your father. Here, it's, I will give you length of life. I will give you, and I'll further grant you long life. Okay, that's the then, if you will. So it's interesting because in a way it's two different things. Okay, one, the first time he gives this promise, he says, I'll give you long life. And the second time he gives the promise, he says, I'll fulfill my promise to David. So, except that it says here, it doesn't say I will fulfill my promise to David. It says, I will fulfill for you. Okay. Here the way the English writes it is only one way of interpreting the sentence. It says, I will fulfill for you the promise that I gave to your father David. I translate the English differently. I will fulfill what I pledged to you as I spoke to David. Okay? So it's the way I read verse 12 is that there is a promise to David that is repeated to Solomon. So let's go back and see what is the actual promise to David. In 2 Samuel, chapter, right. 2 Samuel, chapter 7, verse 2. Here we have David asking for, he's interested in building the temple. And then we have verse 8. Okay, so we're in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 8. Further say thus to my servant David, thus said the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the flock to be ruler of my people Israel. And I've been with you wherever you went, and I've cut down all your enemies before you. Moreover, I will give you great renown, etc. Now look at verse 10. Here's the promise to David. I will establish a home for my people Israel, will plant them firm, so that they shall dwell secure and shall trouble no more. And then he goes on, and he says, verse 12, when your days are done and you lie with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, one of your own issue, and I will establish his kingship. He will build a house for my name, etc., etc. But 15, but I will never withdraw my favor from him as I withdrew it from Saul, whom I removed to make room for you. Your house and your kingship shall ever be secure before you. Your throne shall be established forever. So one of the things that you can read, verse 12, is saying, I will fulfill the promise I made to you, okay, to you, Solomon, because in verse 3, he also tells him about, he repeats to him the promise that if you look in chapter 3, verse 6, going on, no, not verse 6. And he says, verse 13, and I also grant you what you did not ask, both riches and glory all your life, the like of which no king has ever had. So there we have power. Okay, now further grant you long life. Okay, so that parallels what we have here, because here, so the long life can also refer to long life for you yourself, but it could also refer to long life for your kingdom, long life for the house of David. In other words, your house will continue, all right? But in any case, I think this idea of verse 13 is nowhere really mentioned as part of the promise to David or to Solomon. The promises to David and Solomon are that, like for Solomon, you will have long life, or you will rule wisely, and you will, be a good king. And to David, that the house of David will perpetuate, and there will be a temple. But I think that the verse 13 is a separate promise. It is a promise that talks about what is the essence of the temple to begin with. The essence of the temple: I will dwell within my people, my children, the children of Israel, and I will never forsake my people Israel. And in fact, I think we could see that there is an echo of this idea, verse 13. We have an echo in Exodus. Let's go back to Exodus, and we're going to be going back to Exodus a few times, because the actual details of what to build in a temple is really only in Exodus. And that's one of the things we're going to also be dealing with as we study. So if you look at Exodus chapter 25, this is where the idea of a temple is first raised. And it says, if we look at verse 8, Exodus 25, verse 8, and let them make me a temple that I may dwell among them. Okay, that I may dwell among them. It's exactly the same word in Hebrew here. Here, when Solomon says, okay, I'm about to start the temple, and he's starting, and God says to him, I'm promising you, I will dwell amongst the children of Israel, and I will never abandon or forsake my nation of Israel. So the idea of dwelling, we see first and foremost in Exodus 25:8. But then we also see in Leviticus, we see the temple continues to be discussed, and we have additional understanding of what is involved. So if you look at Leviticus 26, verse 11, okay, I establish okay, here the Hebrew is mishkani, my mishkan, okay? Mishkan is from the same root as the word in Hebrew v'shachanti, which is the word I translated as to dwell. So it's also the word that's used for tabernacle. Tabernacle literally means a dwelling, okay? So I would translate this, I will establish my dwelling place or my tabernacle in your midst, and I will not spurn you. I will be ever present in your midst. I will be your God, and you shall be my people. I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out from the land of the Egyptians to be their slaves no more, who broke the bars of your yoke and made you walk erect. Okay, so what you see here, on the one hand, we have echoed again the idea of the dwelling. I will dwell within you. My dwelling will be within you, in your midst. I will be ever present in your midst. That idea is repeated here as well. But what we also have here is a certain identification or a description of the relationship between God and the people of Israel as a mutual relationship. I will be your God, and you shall be my people. Okay, and it reminds us of a covenant, and this idea that there are two sides to the relationship. I will be your God, you will be my people. And so that's something that is very much here. Now, what we also, and that we don't see mentioned here in our own chapter 6, However, there's something else that we see here, and that's in verse 11. We're back in Leviticus 26, verse 11, and I will not spurn you, okay? Or I would say more literal translation will be, I will not be disgusted by you, okay? Now, if we take that verse and we look further to the end of chapter 26, same chapter in Leviticus, we go to the end, and this chapter really is, we're in the middle, in chapter 26 of Leviticus, we are in the middle of the text of the of a covenant. Okay, this is the covenant that was executed between God and the nation of Israel in the desert, okay, at Mount Sinai. And so the first part that we read, chapters 11, verses 11, 12, and 13, is part of the blessings, all the good things that will happen if you obey my commandments. And then starting with verse 14, we go into bad things that will happen to the nation of Israel if they disobey God. Okay, and then we go to the end. Okay, and it's very interesting because at the end it talks about the ultimate curse, the ultimate punishment is exile, being thrown out of the country. And then it says as follows. Let's look at verse 41. When I in turn have been hostile to them and have removed them into the land of their enemies, then at last shall their obdurate heart humble itself, and they shall atone for their iniquity. So this is beginning description of they're going to get thrown to, they've been removed to the land of their enemies. Then will I remember my covenant with Jacob. I will remember also my covenant with Isaac, and also my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. For the land shall be forsaken by let's go on. Okay, let's go now to verse 44. Yet, even then, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them, nor spurn them, so as to destroy them, annulling my covenant with them, for I, the Lord, am your God. What is he saying here? First of all, it's the very exact same words that he uses here when he talks about, not here, going back to the beginning of the verse, or the beginning of the chapter. So at the beginning of the chapter, we saw in verse 11, in verse 11, I will not spurn you, okay? At the very end, that's in the good part. In the very end, well, actually, we should look at verse 32. They spurned me. They spurned my laws. But what does God say in the very next sentence? I will not spurn them. I will never reject them totally. Okay? So we have that idea also connected with the tabernacle, the fact that this is a forever relationship with God. And that very much connects, if we look now back to our verse 13, I will never forsake my people Israel. This is an echo of what we saw in Leviticus and in Exodus. There is this idea that regardless of any kind of sin or whatever, even if there's an exile, even if there is a distancing between God and the nation, it will never be forsaken. And so this promise here in verse 13, I am convinced, is not conditional. It is unconditional. Okay? Now, okay, one other thing that I want to point out is where did this is something I think that will become relevant later when we're discussing the differences between the tabernacle and the temple. One of the differences that we can see here already is, and we knew this already from before, we see that it is Solomon it's David originally who asked to build the temple, and now it's Solomon who initiates the building of the temple. What we don't have in any place here is a prophet or God speaking to Solomon or to David and say, I command you to build the temple. We don't have that at all. Unlike what we have in Exodus, where the initiative comes from God. He says, I want you to build the temple. And one of the things that's very clear about that, if we look at 2 Samuel, back to 2 Samuel chapter 7 again, when David makes the request, he says, I'm sitting in a beautiful palace and the ark is sitting in a tent, and I'd like to build a temple. What does God say to him? He says in verse 6, this is 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 6, from the day that I brought the people of Israel out of Egypt to this day, talking about David's day, I have not dwelt in a house, but have moved about in tent and tabernacle. As I moved about wherever the Israelites went, did I ever reproach any of the tribal leaders who I appointed to care for my people? Why have you not built me a house of cedar? There is an assumption here that God, on the one hand, God says, yes, you can build me a temple, but it won't be you, David, it's going to be your son. On the other hand, God makes another statement, and you're saying, I didn't ask for this. I never asked for this. And I think that's something we want to make sure to keep in mind. This may be a distinguishing point between what we're seeing in Exodus, where God said, you shall make me a temple so that I may dwell within the nation. And here we see with David that God makes it very clear, this is your request, this is not my request, okay? But on the other hand, and this is something that I want to make sure to focus, to mention, in Exodus, God does not say in that initial commandment, you shall create for me a temple so that I may dwell within you, okay? That's in Exodus 25. It doesn't say tabernacle. It doesn't say dwelling. It says temple. Now, in fact, in Exodus, they're building a tabernacle. They're building a temporary tent-like structure, okay? A temple you can think of as stone and brick and mortar and all that kind of stuff. The word temple never again comes up, because from then on, when you get to the actual instructions, it's all about a tent of meeting, or tabernacle. Those are the words that are used. Mishkan, okay, or ohel, all right? And here we come back to the using of the word temple, and when we're talking about Solomon's temple, there's no question we're talking about a building. There's no tents here. This is a very, very huge structure of a building. But I think it's very interesting that even though that when God makes the commandment for the temple in Exodus, that first commandment, he uses the word temple. And it is for that reason and a few other reasons that the assumption is that the essential commandment to build a temple is only in Exodus, but that it applies and it carries forward to our situation as well. Okay, and so that's something to keep in mind, etc. And that perhaps is why we have David and then Solomon initiating the building of the temple. Okay, so one more thing that I wanted to say, this is connected to what we saw earlier in Leviticus, where part of this whole temple idea was not just to dwell within the nation, but to have a mutual relationship. I will be your God, you will be my people. So we're back in our own chapter 6, 1 Kings chapter 6. Let's look at the very end of the chapter, or towards the end. Yeah, the very end, the last verse, okay? And here we have a certain summation statement, verse 38. And in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, that is the 8th month, the house, oh wait, no, excuse me. Okay, no, excuse me. That verse is saying something else. Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, so that's basically what we're talking about here, that when we use the word temple, or it encompasses the tabernacle, it is a place both in Exodus and here where we see that the purpose of this temple is to connect the nation of Israel in a mutual way with God, and to have a place where God will dwell amongst us, okay? And that is common to both tabernacle and to the temple. And as we said, when God gives the instruction initially in Exodus, he uses the word temple, and so those ideas follow through to here as well. Okay, now I just want to make it clear where everything is, and for that I want to go to the end of chapter 6. And in the 11th year, the month of Bul, that is the 8th month, the house was completed according to all its details and all its specifications. We continue now to chapter 7. It took him 7 years to build it, and it took Solomon 13 years to build his palace until his whole palace was completed. He built the Lebanon forest house with 4 rows of cedar columns, blah, blah, blah. And then we continue on to verse 8. The house that he used as a residence in the rear courtyard back of the portico was of the same construction. Solomon also constructed a palace like that portico for the daughter of Pharaoh, whom he had married. Okay, so what actually is going on here is at the end of chapter 6, we have it's kind of like an in-between ending, because chapter 7 goes back to building some of the instruments and some of the items that will go into the temple. But in the middle, we have like this summary that talks about the fact that it took him 7 years to build the temple, and immediately segues into 13 years it took him to build his palace. And he not only built his own palace, he built actually 3 palaces. He built his own palace, he built a house called the Lebanon Forest House, which is called that, it seems, because it is built of Lebanese cedars, and he built a palace for the daughter of Pharaoh. Now, very important to understand that there is a distance between these. There is the compound in Jerusalem in what today we refer to as the city of David. Okay, that was ancient Jerusalem in the time of Solomon's time, and that's where the palaces were, not where the house of God was. The house of God was on the Temple Mount. So for those of you who've been to Israel, you can probably easily picture it. Temple Mount is above the Western Wall. Okay, so you go down from there. If you go out the Dung Gate, you cross the street, you go to the city of David, and you continue going down, 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 down. Okay, so there's quite a difference in altitude between where the Temple Mount is and where the city of David, or the city of Jerusalem in David's time. And we can see also that, let's talk just briefly about what these 2 places were. So the actual temple is built on the threshing floor that David had bought from Arnan or Aravna, the Jebusite. So if you look at the very last verses of 2 Samuel, we see that. And what does he see let's look at the last 2 verses of 2 Samuel. But the king replied to Aravna, "No, I will buy them from you at a price. I cannot sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that have cost me nothing." Now, this is the important part. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver, and David built there an altar to the Lord and sacrificed burnt offerings and offerings of well-being. Okay, so basically, he already sets the stage for the temple. He buys that threshing floor, and he already puts the altar there. And it is there where that altar is that they're going to end up building the temple. Now, this is said very, very clearly in Chronicles. If you look at 2 Chronicles, chapter 3. 2 Chronicles, chapter 3, the first verse reads as follows. Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David, at the place which David had designated at the threshing floor of Arnan the Jebusite. Now, it's interesting that the Chronicles calls the same guy Arnan, and 2 Samuel calls him Aravna. It's very similar names, and it's clearly the same guy, but maybe his name changed over time. But anyway, so we know that it was that's where the temple was built, and that the threshing floor is the same place as Mount Moriah. Now, where do we learn about Mount Moriah? From the binding of Isaac, okay? And if you don't believe me, if you want to take a quick glance at where that is, in Genesis 22, verse 2, take your son, your favorite one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights, one of the hills that I will point out to you. Okay, so that's also very significant and something we will talk about in terms of what is it significant, but it's important to keep in mind. The temple is built on Mount Moriah, the very same place where Abraham goes up to sacrifice his son Isaac. Okay, it is not in the same place as where Solomon has his palaces, which is down below. And we also have, if we look in just the next chapter, chapter 7, 1 Kings chapter 7, wait, where is it? Chapter 7, verse 13. No, not chapter 7, verse 13. Where did I put it? Didn't write it down, but I know where it is. Okay, excuse me, chapter 8. Look at chapter 8, the first verse of chapter 8. Then Solomon convoked the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes and the ancestral chieftains of the Israelites before King Solomon in Jerusalem to bring up the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord from the city of David, that is Zion. Okay, and where are they bringing it? They're bringing it up to where he built the temple. Look at verse 6. The priest brought the ark of the Lord's covenant to its place underneath the wings of the cherubim in the shrine of the house in the Holy of Holies, in the temple itself. So that also tells us going up. Okay, the city of David is down below. That's where the palace was. David, before he died, did two things. He brought the ark and created some kind of a tent, some kind of a tabernacle tent sort of thing for the ark down near his palace in the city of David. Meantime, before the end of his life, he bought the field up on the Temple Mount from the Jebusite, and he put an altar there. And that's how he left it for Solomon. Solomon then is going to build the temple around the altar, and then he's going to bring the ark from down below and put it from its tent, put it in its permanent place out on the temple. So that's just as we follow the various verses, we can also see what it is we're talking about, what is the geography, etc. Okay, I think we have done as much as we're going to be able to do today. We will take up, we still have some more verses that we're going to review, a few more verses and some of their significance to learn something more about the temple. And then we're going to go into a comparison, comparison of details of what was the actual structural differences between the tabernacle and the temple. And remember, this is extremely significant because the original command for the tabernacle, for the temple, is when it's commanded for the temple. Say that again. The original command for the temple actually takes place in Exodus, where God commands to build the tabernacle. So you have to compare them, and you have to see if there are differences. Why do we have those differences? Okay, so this is something we're going to keep in mind as we go into next week's lesson. So that's all for today. Any questions? Just go ahead.
More of a comment, really. All these measurements and details are very important for me. They give me confidence in the physical reality of these structures, the ark, the tabernacle, and the temple. And also they give me confidence looking forward to the physical reality of Ezekiel's temple. That's the first point.
There's no question. I didn't ever mean to say that measurements are not important. We are going to be analyzing those measurements next week, okay? Because the differences in the measurements between the temple and the tabernacle are very critical. All I was saying, instead of reading it in order of the verses, yeah, I'm kind of putting together a picture and then seeing how we back that up. Because if we read it in order, we get bogged down in the details and we don't see the whole picture.
I didn't think for one moment that you were dispensing with the details.
Yeah, no. So, but you know what? There are the materials, and there's some things that, for example, that's very interesting. They talk about in one place, windows that are, I have to find it, but they talk about windows that are clear and opaque. If we translate those words the way we would translate it today, what does that mean? Okay, or not necessarily opaque, clear but solid or sealed. Okay, now they didn't have glass. Today, we would understand that easily. But look behind me. I have a glass window. The window is completely sealed, right? You can't get in or out. No air, no water, unless it was made wrong. But thank God these are made right. But you can, they're clear. You can see through them. So people picture that that's what the words mean. But it's not at all clear that's what the words mean, because it's Hebrew words that today in modern Hebrew we use it that way, but that doesn't mean that's what the Bible meant when they wrote them. But also, what does that mean? They didn't have glass. They didn't have glass then. So I don't know. And so I'm not dealing with those issues. That's what I meant in terms of the technical. What are some of these materials, and what are they? That is because these are things that scholars themselves continue to discuss because they really don't know. There's all kinds of, once you translate it, you make a decision, but that's the stuff that we're not going to deal with. All right. Any other comments or questions? All right. So you have a good week, and we'll see you again next week.
Okay.
Bye-bye.